Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, Bob Good, former congressman from Virginia's 5th District. More importantly, I'm a born-again Christian, and I'm a biblical and a constitutional conservative. I've been married for nearly 37 years to my beautiful wife, Tracy, and we have 3 children and 3 grandchildren. And I know on a personal level what the cost is of confronting the tough issues and taking a stand in Washington. I'm going to tell you during this podcast, not so much today, but during the podcast as we move along, what it's really like in Congress, who's doing the right things and who's doing the wrong things, and what members of Congress should be doing for the American people. I'm not loyal to a political party. I'm not loyal to a political person. I'm loyal to my Savior, my wife and children, my country, the Constitution, and to speaking truth. I want to ask you to please be sure and subscribe to this podcast. Follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Rate the show and share it with your friends. As I mentioned, I recently had the privilege of serving in Congress, and I represented Virginia's 5th District for 4 years. I was proud to be rated as the most conservative member of Congress by just about every conservative group that does congressional scorecards. I was a member of the House Freedom Caucus for all 4 years that I was in D.C., and I was chairman of the Freedom Caucus my last year there. I spent most of my time in Congress fighting to end the border invasion, to protect our constitutional freedoms, and to address our spending, our debt, our deficit, and our fiscal situation. Thankfully, President Trump has eliminated about 99% of the border invasion through the executive actions that he's put in place. A concern would be that those are temporary and could be reversed by a future Democrat president. Just see what Biden did over the last 4 years. But we're not going to talk a lot about the border invasion initially, certainly not in this podcast today. What I want to do is, while we'll focus a lot on constitutional freedoms and especially what should be the constitutional limits of the federal government, and in particular, I want to focus this inaugural episode, though, on the fiscal or the spending issues, and especially what I've called the big, beautiful bill. Of course, it's commonly referred to as, or what I call it, the big, ugly bill. But as you know, it's commonly referred to as the big, beautiful bill. And I will acknowledge that while, sadly, like most things in Washington, it is indeed big, I submit to you it's far from beautiful, no matter how many people call it that, no matter how many times they say it, and no matter who says it. It's not beautiful, though, because it's a massive failure on the most important responsibility of Congress, which is managing our nation's finances, ensuring our ability to meet our obligations, and preserving our fiscal integrity, including our ability to borrow when necessary. Specifically, the Constitution says, and we'll talk a lot about the Constitution on this podcast, that pesky little founding document that was written nearly 250 years ago by the founders to set the limits or the parameters for the power of the federal government. And specifically, Article 1 of the Constitution describes the powers of what was intended to be the most prominent and most powerful branch of the federal government, the legislative body. It's not really true what people will often say, that 3 co-equal branches of government. The founders intended that the Congress or the legislative body would be the most powerful branch of government because that's the people's representatives. And Article 1, Section 8 conveys the power and responsibility to Congress, the legislative body, the people's representatives, to, quote, lay and collect taxes, pay the debts, and to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Congress, especially the last 50 years, of course, and even worse over the last 8 years, has massively failed at this responsibility. In fact, the debt grew by about $8 trillion in each of the last 2 administrations. The debt has nearly doubled since President Trump was first sworn into office in 2017. And the report card that matters for Congress is indeed the national debt, which currently stands at nearly $37 trillion, which is well over $100,000 for each American citizen. This gives both parties, Republican and Democrat, a failing grade. It took our country about 200 years to reach $1 trillion in national debt until 1981. And now we've added some 36 trillion over the last 44 years, or an average of about $1 trillion a year. Unfortunately, that has accelerated to an average of about 2 trillion a year over the last several years. And the debt is no longer an abstract concept for Americans, or for those economists with the green visors, because Americans are increasingly suffering or feeling the consequences of that debt and the reckless spending by Congress. How are they feeling this? Of course, you know this. They're feeling it because of higher inflation, things costing more because of all the government spending, and higher interest rates as a reflection of the cost of that debt. Anybody who's tried to buy a home recently knows how much this is true. So the days of spending without consequence are over. And the ratings agencies have continued to downgrade our credit, Moody's being the most recent one just a week or two ago. And that's going to cause even further higher interest rates and further hurt Americans. The truth is that every dollar that Congress votes to spend, every dollar that Congress votes to spend is borrowed. And every borrowed dollar results in more inflation, higher interest rates, higher taxes, and more debt that has to be paid in the future by our kids and our grandkids. In fact, the interest on the debt is about $1 trillion a year, or about $3,000 per American. And that brings us back to the primary discussion today about the big ugly bill. Republicans, had control of Congress for the last 2 years before January, and they did nothing when they had the majority in the House. During those last 2 years, had the majority in the House. They did nothing with either former Speaker McCarthy or Speaker Johnson, did nothing to address the spending, to address the debt, to address the fiscal crisis in our country. They repeatedly promised over and over the last 2 years that next time they would cut spending. But with Congress, next time never seems to get here. They promised that if we could get full control of government, if we could get the Senate, we could get the White House, then we'd cut spending. To add insult to injury, at the end of last year in December, as the final act of the outgoing Congress, that Republicans in the House passed another continuing resolution, or a CR, keeping in place the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer policies and spending levels that had been in place before Republicans got control of Congress 2 years earlier. And they added hundreds of billions in new spending at the end of the year onto the CR. And they did it once again with predominantly Democrat votes. 196 Democrats voted for it. No Democrat voted against it. And of course, when that happened at the end of last year, Speaker Johnson and Republicans promised we'll cut spending this year when we have full control of government, when we have the Senate, the House, and the White House, or the trifecta. But then what did Republicans do back in February? In order to avoid a government shutdown, they passed another CR, a continuing resolution, that once again didn't cut spending. It essentially kept the spending levels in place, again, from when Democrats had full control of government, the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer spending levels and the policies. And they extended the funding of the government to the end of the fiscal year to September 30 with that CR. And they promised that what they would do is cut spending, deal with the debt, deal with the deficit in reconciliation this spring, right now. And that they would deal with it in the appropriations process this summer when the 12 individual spending bills are due by September 30. So here we are at that reconciliation process, where Republicans have this unique opportunity right now to do whatever they want with respect to cutting spending. They don't need any Democrat votes, and they don't have to meet the 60-vote threshold in the Senate to avoid a filibuster. Reconciliation is a unique process that happens once a term, where a budget bill can be passed, again, where it doesn't require 60 votes in the Senate, and it's called reconciliation. It's an exercise where Chuck Schumer has no ability to block it. So Republicans will totally own this product, which they have named, again, the big, beautiful bill, and they can't blame Democrats for it. I'm not going to focus as much today on what's in or out of this current version of this bill, the big, ugly bill, as I call it, but rather I'm going to focus and talk about its negative budgetary or fiscal impact, meaning what's it doing to our debt and our deficit? And we're going to talk about the missed opportunity here for Republicans. Both houses of Congress have to act on this budget resolution that is called the reconciliation process. And the House went first and passed their bill about a week ago. It's a bill that contains very little in the way of spending cuts. It's projected to add $4 trillion to the debt over 10 years, on top of how much the debt would grow if they did nothing. So if this bill wasn't passed, the debt would grow by some $20 to $25 trillion over the next 10 years, meaning taking this to somewhere in the range of $60 trillion from the current $37 trillion. But this bill will actually add $4 trillion more because there's not enough spending cuts in it to offset the tax increases that are being extended. I actually get frustrated with those in the conservative media who will say this bill will add $4 trillion to the debt, which is technically true, again, that it's $4 trillion additionally. But again, that is on top of the 20 to 25 trillion that the debt's going to go up in the next 10 years without the bill. So Republicans are voting, the House Republicans voted, all but 3 of them, voted to increase the debt to some $60 trillion over the next 10 years with this bill. You can't say you're a fiscal conservative or that you're serious about the debt when you pass a bill like that with totally Republican votes that takes the debt from $37 trillion to $60 trillion. But it's even worse than that, because even that target of how much it's going to increase the debt over the next 10 years, again, the $4 trillion additional on top of the 25 trillion with the current deficits of about $2 trillion a year, it's even worse than that because they use funny or gimmicky congressional math to even come up with that $4 trillion. What they do is they pretend that the tax cuts that are put in the bill will expire. Some of those will expire in 5 years in the 10-year budget window. And of course, they're going to come back in 5 years and extend those tax cuts so it'll cost even more. Furthermore, a lot of the spending reductions, matter of fact, the majority of the spending reductions don't happen until years 6 through 10. So they're pretending that they will actually not cancel or rescind those spending cuts that they don't want to go into effect right away. You know, it's easy to have tax cuts go into effect right now and have spending cuts go into effect in future years. But future Congresses can just come back and eliminate those spending cuts. But so with pretending that they won't extend the tax cuts and pretending they will actually implement the spending cuts, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now, they come up with the $4 trillion increase on top of the 20 to 25 trillion that it would raise if they didn't even do this bill. So if nothing changes, think about the midterms a year and a half from now. If nothing changes, Republicans will be running in the midterm elections on taking the debt to nearly $40 trillion, again, with a current $2 trillion deficit. We're nearly $37 trillion now, so a year and a half from now. They're going to run on taking the debt to $40 trillion, passing a debt-exploding reconciliation bill with no Democrat votes, so Republicans will totally own that, and having done nothing to change the nation's negative fiscal trajectory. That's what they will own going into the midterms. Also, I know there's a lot of numbers in this discussion, but think about this. The debt only has to grow by about 10% from the current nearly 37 trillion to get to 40 trillion. Well, the debt has grown by 10% over just the last 2 years. The debt only has to grow by about 35% to get to 50 trillion. Well, the debt grew by 35% over just the last 5 years. And the debt only has to grow by 60% to reach 60 trillion. Well, the debt grew by 60% over just the last 6 years. So we're in a snowball effect with the amount of the dollars of the debt, with the interest rates accelerating, the amount of the debt, and it's just a snowball effect where it's growing faster and faster and faster, and that's not sustainable. The debt has doubled since 2015 in the last 10 years. If it doubles again in the next 10 years, it would be $73 trillion by 2035, which is the time period when this current budget reconciliation bill would expire. So this is it. This is the only opportunity Republicans have really during the Trump term to deal with the spending, to deal with the deficit, to deal with the debt, to deal with the nation's fiscal crisis. This is the only realistic opportunity they have to do something about the debt that they've inherited from the Biden administration. Again, Republicans have been complicit in some of this because next year, well, first of all, they can do this again, this budget reconciliation bill with just 51 votes. That's why Republicans can do whatever they want. They can't blame Democrats because they don't need 60 votes in the Senate. But you know that if they're not going to do it with 51 vote threshold now in this reconciliation process, they won't do it with the appropriations bills this year that are due by September 30. They're not going to do it next year in an election year in the midterms. And then after the midterms, God forbid, the Democrats may have control of the House, and President Trump would be a lame duck president come 2027 after the midterms. So this is the opportunity to do it now when they have the momentum of the wins that President Trump has put on the board, the momentum that he has being a new president. This is the opportunity to do it. All bets are off for 2026. I want to acknowledge, and I'd be remiss not to do so, the work that my friends in the Freedom Caucus have done to make this reconciliation bill better. This big ugly bill, as I call it. They fought for the $1.5 trillion in spending cuts that are in the bill, but that's $1.5 trillion over 10 years, so about $150 billion a year when we have a $2 trillion annual deficit. So it's a very small amount in the grand scheme of things, but that wouldn't have happened without the Freedom Caucus, because before the Freedom Caucus fought for that, they were talking about only cutting maybe $300 billion, if that, over 10 years. The Freedom Caucus also fought to accelerate or to the reductions in the IRA climate credit. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, really the Inflation Increase Act that was passed when Democrats had full control of government, they put these massive climate subsidies in there, these massive climate tax credits in there for unreliable, unaffordable energy products that are estimated to cost $1 to $2 trillion. Because the Freedom Caucus, about half of those are going to be repealed. That's not enough. It should be all of them. It should happen right away. Some of it's not happened for later years in the reconciliation bill. But that was a result of the Freedom Caucus. And then there were some modest cuts and reductions, reforms to Medicaid that only happened because of the Freedom Caucus. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, or it would actually be reducing the deficit instead of increasing the deficit. But I want to credit my Freedom Caucus friends for working on that. But they withstood a lot of pressure to do that. And that's one of the problems in Washington. Why is all the pressure directed at the conservatives? Why don't we have pressure directed at the moderates, the rhinos, the so-called Republicans who are fighting to protect funding for those IRA climate credits? They're fighting to protect and keep Medicaid, which has exploded by some 50% during the Biden administration. They're fighting to protect funding for Planned Parenthood. They're fighting to increase the SALT, state and local tax deductions for high tax states, blue states like New York and California. The SALT tax deduction was taken down to $10,000 in the 2017 Trump's original tax cuts to help pay for those. And now the current Republican bill in the House quadruples that to $40,000, which will only benefit the elites, the wealthy in these high tax blue states. But why isn't the pressure on those moderates? Why don't they get threatened with primary challenges and pressure from the White House and pressure from the leadership? No, it always seems to be the conservatives who get the pressure, the Thomas Masseys, the Rand Pauls, who are showing courage and principle and standing up for fiscal responsibility. Where are we today when in the Republican Party, if you fight for spending cuts, you fight for spending reductions and fiscal responsibility, that you're then called a grandstander and you're criticized as just being a showman or a grandstander when you're fighting for Republicans to do what they actually told the American people they would do if the American people trusted Republicans with full control of government. Every Republican every Republican ran last year on fiscal responsibility, on cutting spending, on addressing our debt, our deficit, in our fiscal crisis, and yet so many Republicans don't seem to really want to cut spending. And again, our nation just can't afford it. This is the opportunity, this reconciliation bill. This is the opportunity to deal with that now. So it's not too late because it's passed out of the House, but it now goes to the Senate. The Senate can make the big ugly bill less ugly. They can make it better. And it's patriots like my friends Ron Johnson from Wisconsin and Mike Lee from Utah, Rand Paul from Kentucky, and Rick Scott from Florida who are fighting and trying to do just that. It's pretty bad, if you know your history with Congress, it's pretty bad that we're looking to the Senate and we're counting on the Senate to come in and rescue a bad spending bill. We're counting on the Senate to come in and make this big bill more beautiful or less ugly, because that rarely ever happens. So if you live in Florida, if you live in Kentucky, if you live in Utah, or if you live in Wisconsin, it's critically important that you support your senator's efforts because they're under tremendous pressure to fold, to go along with what the Republicans in the House have done, just to cave and to give in. So you need to support those senators if you live in those states. More importantly, across the country, we need to demand that the other 49 Republican senators support the efforts of Senator Paul, Senator Johnson, Senator Scott, and Senator Lee, who are fighting to put real spending cuts and spending reforms in this big, currently ugly bill. Republicans, here's the difference between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans need to use the 26 midterms, the elections that come next year, as motivation to go big, to swing for the fences, to meet the moment, to rise to the occasion, to deliver for the American people, because again, there's no guarantee after 26. Instead of being fearful about the midterm elections and playing small ball or being careful or being tepid or being meek and modest, we ought to be going for broke, going big, going bold, and cutting spending now. And I think the American people just might reward Republicans with greater numbers in Congress if the Republican Party actually did what it said it would do, if the American people saw them actually fighting for them, cutting our spending, and reducing the deficit and addressing the national debt and putting us on a path to fiscal responsibility. Democrats are willing to lose elections. That's been demonstrated to advance their agenda. Think about the first 2 years of the Biden administration when the Democrats had full control of government. They had the House with Pelosi as Speaker. They had the Senate with Schumer as Majority Leader, and they had Biden, of course, in the White House. And they went big. They rammed through their massive agenda without any Republican votes. They passed these huge spending bills. They implemented their policies and spending levels under which, again, the American people are still suffering today because the Republican House didn't fight to reverse those over the last 2 years and kept them in place. And what happened to the Democrats when they did that in the first 2 years of the Biden administration? They lost control of the House in the 22 midterms because they knew that Republicans wouldn't do anything to reverse it. Republicans would be afraid to shut down the government. Republicans would be afraid to stare down the Democrats and go to the mat. I hope Republicans learned something with what Chuck Schumer did back with this CR that was passed back in earlier this year, where Chuck Schumer caved because he didn't want to shut down the government. Republicans shouldn't be afraid about shutting down the government. They shouldn't be afraid of the 26 midterms. They need to show courage and they need to show principle. Not one Republican voted for these climate tax credits that are in that Inflation Reduction Act or the Inflation Increase Act. But yet, again, we've got some Republicans fighting to protect those in the House and the Senate. And so this is the time for the Republicans to meet the moment, to show courage, to show resolve, to show principle. You know, this country is still, as President Lincoln said at Gettysburg about those who died to preserve this. Of course, we remembered our heroes, those who served and died at Memorial Day just recently. But President Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address talked about how this is a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. This still is, but it's only that if we participate, if we engage, if we make our voices heard, if we hold our elected representatives accountable to do what they say they will do, for Republicans to actually do Republican stuff, for Republicans to return to becoming the party of fiscal responsibility, the party of lower spending, cutting spending, reducing deficits, addressing the national debt. The Republican Party needs to be that. Our role in keeping the republic, it was Ben Franklin who famously said, "Hey, we've given you a republic if you can keep it." Our role in keeping the republic is, again, holding our elected officials accountable. When I was in Washington over the past 4 years, I would often tell my Republican colleagues, we will never make a difference, or we will never change Washington until it becomes more important to us to leave having made a difference than it is to see how long we can stay. Let me say it again. I would tell my Republican colleagues in DC, we will never change Washington, or save the country for that matter, until it becomes more important to us to leave Washington having made a difference than it is to see how long we can stay. Sadly, most elected representatives in Washington, their main priority is seeing how long they can stay. Their main priority is to be in Congress, to stay in Congress, to get reelected so they can be in Congress and stay in Congress, hopefully to die in Congress. And that trumps everything else for most elected representatives in Washington. That cannot be the case, and we cannot allow that to be the case of our elected representatives. So I want to thank you for joining me for this inaugural Good for America podcast. I want to encourage you again to please subscribe to this podcast, to follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good, rate the show, and share it with your friends. Let's keep the republic.